Good morning, everyone. Welcome to First Congregational Church of Langsburg's online service. Thank you for joining us here in this digital space. My name is Vicki and I'll be your host for today. I'm in Abaco and I'm at the southern end in the Bahamas, so welcome. Today is the 23rd week of Ordinary Time and marks the eve of All Saints' Day, where we remember those we love that have passed on. So today will be a little different then, because we have a special service dedicated to this act of remembrance. And as always, we do so with a few poems, prayers, and readings for us along the way. Blessings on the journey.
And draw me into his eternity, but who can rise up to that holy place? Can all its splendors really be for me? Before that holy fire I hide my face, my hands were never clean. As for my heart, he'll search out its impurity and trace the sources of its sin in every part. And in the whole, its weariness and stain, who can ascend? I cannot even start. But even as I fear, my hopes are vain. My Savior comes, his love revives my hope. I feel him search my wounds, deal with my pain, and offer me again the healing cup. Raising my head, he says, "Now rise with me, the gates will open for us both. Look up." Psalm 24, retold by Malcolm Guite.
Good morning, everyone. Today's prayer is written by Dr. Tom. O God, you are the keeper of the book of life, and no one dies alone, but under all of your loving grace. Therefore, their passing is not an empty data point on death's grim graph. So let us say the names of those who have died, and to remember them.
Big Jim.
Lucy, Indy, Harry and Alice, Jay and Teresa.
Stanley and Wilda Baldwin, Stanley and Jean Morrill.
Margaret Ann.
Jimmy George Putnam.
Jack.
Grandpa Bartol, Jacob, and Adam.
My dad, Alfred Chester Hemmingson.
John Hogan, Bob Holt.
Penny.
Tom Eppinga.
Helen Elizabeth Nabosny Hemmingson. My mom.
Granby.
Fred Protis.
Brad Crotis.
Into your hands, O Lord, we commend their spirits. Hear our prayer.
And so today I'm going to be reading When Great Trees Fall by Maya Angelou. When great trees fall, rocks on distant hills shudder. Lions hunker down in tall grasses, and even elephants lumber after safety. When great trees fall in forests, small things recoil into silence, their senses eroded beyond fear. When great souls die, the air around us becomes light, rare, sterile. We breathe briefly, our eyes briefly see with a hurtful clarity. Our memory, suddenly sharpened, examines, gnaws on kind words unsaid, promised walks never taken. Great souls die, and our reality, bound to them, takes leave of us. Our souls depend upon their nurture, now shrink, wizened. Our minds, formed and informed by their radiance, fall away. we are not so much maddened as reduced to unutterable ignorance of dark, cold caves. And when great souls die, after a period, peace blooms, slowly and always, irregularly. Spaces fill with a kind of soothing electric vibration. Our senses restored, never to be the same, whisper to us, they existed. They existed. We can be and be better, for they existed.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our All Saints Day service of remembrance. And today has been a little bit different, a little more reflective, and a little bit more in the subdued realm, because we are taking on a somber topic that a lot of us are a little bit nervous to take on. We usually don't want to talk about death, dying process until we're sitting at the funeral, or we're in hospice, or we're at the hospital. And this is something that we have, it's a topic that as a culture we've kind of shoved it away from the everyday life, the very naturalness of death, and we've shoved it into the corners of hospitals and funeral homes and in the back parts of churches, and to be taken care of at those times and never to be looked at until then. And Stanley Hauerwas is a theologian that I respect, and he said that we all have this dream of dying in our sleep peacefully, not even knowing death is coming. Whereas 500 years ago, Christians used to say, "Lord, save me from a sudden death," because they wanted to be able to reconcile with their loved ones, even their enemies, and with their God before passing on. And they didn't want a sudden death to rob them of that opportunity of reconciliation. So then he goes on to say, today we fear death when back in the day they feared God. And I think a lot of that is true. We have this fear of our own mortality and our own death, our own fragility. And we're going to take that passage on today from John 11, where Jesus approaches the family of Lazarus, and Lazarus is passed on. He's 3 days late. It's coming, or 4 days late coming. And they wanted Jesus to come and rescue Lazarus from the sickness. He didn't come. He died. And everyone's kind of left wondering, what in the world just happened? Why didn't you come, Jesus? So this is a traditional passage we look at when talking about the death and dying process. So we're going to have this passage read to us by Nikki, and then we'll explore a little bit on the other side of what we could have for us today.
Today's reading is from John chapter 11, verses 32 through 44. When Mary arrived where Jesus was and caught sight of him, she fell at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her were weeping, he groaned within himself and became troubled. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus gave way to tears. At that, the Jews began to say, "See what affection he has for him?" But some of them said, "Could not this man who opened the eyes of a blind man prevent this one from dying?" Then Jesus, after groaning again within himself, came to the tomb. It was in fact a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take the stone away." Martha, the sister of the deceased, said to him, "Lord, by now he must smell, for it has been 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God?" So they took the stone away. Then Jesus raised his eyes heavenward and said, "Father, I think that you have heard me. True, I know that you always hear me, but I spoke on account of the crowd standing around, so that they may believe you sent me." When he said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The man who had been dead came out with his feet and hands bound with wrappings, and his face was wrapped with cloth. Jesus said to them, "Free him and let him go."
So a friend of mine, who was a new friend at the time, he was suffering with a blood disease, and he had suffered with this blood disease for 14 years, and he knew it was terminal, and doctors told him it was terminal. He had 14 years to contemplate his own mortality, his own impending coming, passing, his death, and I got to sit with him for one of those 14 years, and it was his last year. I got to know him. His name was Jim, and I had never seen somebody more comfortable with their mortality before. He would just talk about his coming death as if he was talking about his coming next meal or his dinner. He had an interesting way about him, very profound and deep man, which I think being in his situation would have brought that about. In his last week, he was in hospice, and it was a very painful week for him. And I was visiting in the hospital with him, and he had this real big bout of pain where his teeth were gritting, and he sat up out of a stupor, a medical stupor, and he looked me straight in the eyes, and he said the words, "Death is easy, dying is the hard part." And he laid back down, and he passed away that night. And those were the last words he ever spoke to me. And those words really affected me. They really stuck with me. I now use them at every funeral that I do. You think of it, death happens without our consent. It just happens. Our heart stops, or our breath stops, or our brain stops. I don't know what they medically determine it now, but all of a sudden we're gone. It just happens. But dying is that process of losing life, or of having a sickness, of having a diagnosis, of having treatments, of going through the hospice situation. And while physical death happens once, it feels like there's these smaller deaths along the way that happen to us, because death is to endure a loss of some kind. And this loss disrupts our current way of being or living in the world. We're in a groove, we're on a path, we got our MO going, and then bam, something happens and rearranges a whole new way of life. We lose our job, and now we got to figure out what in the world, how do I get on the other side of this? The death of a career has happened, or we lose a loved one, or a relationship ends, or something happens, something dies in our life, and then we have to figure out how to be on the other side. These are the different kinds of deaths that we can experience that aren't the great physical death and surrender. And in our passage, Mary comes up to Jesus and says, "If you were here, Lord, if you were here, then it could have been different. You could have prevented this." Because we experience death as abandonment as humans. It's a natural human understanding of death, the experience as a kind of abandonment from God, that God let us down or something didn't work right. Because our minds say that obedience and faithfulness equals protection and blessing. And so if that protection and blessing suddenly disappear in a tragic moment, we think to ourselves, what went wrong? But until that tragic moment hits, we can go on with our life as is, and we're cool, and we're just going about doing our thing, and we believe that obedience and faithfulness equals protection and blessing. But then death, a certain kind of a death, comes and throws all that to the wind and leaves us with the question, why? Why did this happen? Why did that happen? Why did it need to happen? And what we learn from today's passage is that faith is not a lucky talisman that guarantees our protection. And God is not creating a pocket of protected few. God's not creating a pocket of protected few that we're supposed to get on the inside of. But God here in this passage is actually forging a pathway through death and into life. Let's keep exploring this passage and see what we see. So I'm an addict, and so are you. Here's what we're addicted to. We're all addicted to our own perceptions. The way that we see the world, the way that we understand the world, the way that we translate the events of the world, These all get into our brains, and then we take all of those things and then we tell ourselves a story about what we're like, what God's like, what the world's like. And this is our perception or our understanding. And this is what we're all addicted to. We're addicted to our own perceptions and understandings, and it's hard for us to see another way of seeing because we have a way of seeing that is ours. Now, some of the perceptions that we hold to are actually good and helpful. You know, we have a wisdom, a perspective, an insight that we can bring to a situation. And some of these perceptions are harmful and hurtful, and like certain insecurities we hold to, and fears and misconceptions that we cling to. Now, these perceptions that we hold, they build our life's understanding. They hold everything we think about and is true. And then we live according to these things, and it puts us on a trajectory in our life, in an autopiloted direction. We're just going here unreflective because, hey, why not? Nothing's come in to disrupt it until something comes in and disrupts it. And some kind of a tragedy hits, and we're left with this grief place, which causes us to ask the question, why? Why did this happen? And Richard Rohr says the only thing powerful enough to shake us up out of our own perceptions than to get us to see a broader, wider thing are two things, either great love or great suffering. And we will voluntarily disrupt our life, our whole life's trajectory for great love. You know, you fall in love, you want to get married, and you utterly change your entire life's plans in order to do this, right? But then great suffering is the thing that will come in and impose disruption upon our life's trajectory. But they both get us the question, where am I headed? What am I doing? And is this worthy of my attention? And we become like addicted to these repetitive, familiar, comfortable ways of thinking and seeing and being in this world. And sometimes that keeps us in broken places. Now, Christ is coming into a tragic situation where Lazarus has died. He was 4 days late showing up to the party here. And he, you know, in the previous part, why weren't you here? Why didn't you do something? Was the question. And now we're left, Jesus asked the question, where have you laid Lazarus? And he asks us these questions in our times of tragedy and difficulty as well. Where have you laid the rest? Your dreams, your hopes, your perceptions, your understandings, the things that you have clung to, the things that you have hoped for that died, where have you laid them to rest? And there's two responses to this question, and Jesus stands in the middle of them. One is a response of faith, and one is a natural human response of question. And Jesus is in the middle. Now, Mary has the response of faith. Where have you laid Lazarus? Where have you laid your hopes and dreams? And Mary says, come and see. So this is a faithful response of kind of like a prayer, like, God, come and see my life. Come and see the tragedy that is this horrible thing that's happened. And then on the other side, some people start questioning and saying, well, if he could heal a blind person, why couldn't he come and prevent this tragedy from happening? And these two things are a natural human response. We rise up to an occasion with faith, and then also we can cause questions and doubts and say, what the heck is even going on here? Why didn't you protect or come in? And Jesus stands in the middle, and it's the shortest verse of our Bible. It says that Jesus wept. Or Jesus, wept in the middle of this place between faith and question. And he stands there within the human experience with empathy. And this is where we stand. We stand with Christ in these middle places of darkness. And we are somewhere between, we vacillate between, faithful response and human struggling, questioning with darkness. And we vacillate between those two very naturally. And Christ stands in the middle with us with empathy. And it just says Christ wept. And oftentimes we mistake cliche for faith during the death and dying process, which is a very natural response at first. It gets us to the next day. Our narrative says that we're a part of this protected pocket of few, and then all of a sudden that narrative shattered in a tragedy, and we don't know what to do with it. And our fear is that God is against us, and then that amplifies up in the tragedy. Oh, what did I do? Where did I go wrong? Why is God not here and protecting and guiding and all that stuff? So we turn to cliche to try and reconstruct our previous understandings. And we say things like, oh, well, but God has a plan. I don't know the plan, but God has a plan. All things happen for a reason. Or God won't give me anything I can't handle. Or God's ways are not like our ways, and we just can't understand them. These are the cliches that we cling to first off that help us try and reconstruct where we were in the narrative, to try and get back to that narrative of, well, I still am a part of the protected few. But it's very clear in the Bible that death is not God's plan that makes us stronger people. Tragedy is not God's plan to make us stronger people. Athanasius was a early church father, and I love Father Kenneth Tanner's take on Athanasius. He said, Athanasius says that God saw humanity falling from existence into nothingness, and God could not bear to lose the creatures he loved to non-existence, the ones in all creation that alone were made in the image of his eternity. So the Son takes on the one human nature shared by all humans in order to rescue humanity from death. So this death is not a part of God's plan for all of creation, but here it is, in the midst of it, disrupting things. And in our passage today, in our story, Christ starts to give commands. And he does not act, he gives commands. So this shows us that Christ is claiming authority over death. He says, roll the stone aside. And then I'll say, but he stinks. You know, he's been in there 4 days and they didn't do much embalming practices. So they have these reasonable objections to this thing. But then he offers this promise, you will see. Didn't I tell you, you will see the glory of God. And there is this need for action on their part. And they get up. Jesus does not roll the stone aside. He says, commands with authority, roll the stone aside. They object. Then they roll the stone aside. Faith is that action. And it's aimed through the dark toward hope. And this hope is that God is good, and that one day all will be redeemed, and that one day everything will be set right. And if we live with hope and faith in this moment, aiming our life in that trajectory of the greater things of faith, hope, and love, that it will be worth it, and it will lead to resurrection. So it's clear that death is not God's plan. Death is not in company with God. Death is not used by God as a tool. Death is the very enemy of God and God's good creation. And God saw death swallowing up all of his children, and yet, because God is infinite, could not go into the very finite place of death and save us. So God did the radical, and God took on human flesh in the person of Jesus and lived a perfectly human life, experiencing all of our humanness. And then because Jesus was so pure in human life in ways we could never accomplish, he entered death as a human and disarmed it from the inside out. So death swallowed up Christ's humanity, but Christ's purity totally and completely defeated death. And now the pure grace and love and gift of God is to offer this new humanity to all of us as our new destiny. And of course, we still die. Even though death is defeated, death takes all of us one day. But Christ says in this passage, Lazarus, come out, unbind him and let him go. And that shows Christ's authority over death. He commands it. And I like what Thomas Merton says. He says, the forces of life must win. And Christians must rediscover the truth that the cross is a sign of life, renewal, affirmation, and joy. Not death, repression, negation, and the refusal of life. You see, Christ has crossed the threshold of death and utterly disarmed it. And death has now become the gateway to more life, to eternal life, to greater life. So when we pass through death willingly and humbly and full of faith, we can only experience more life. All the little deaths along the way that we experience, when we cross them over in this manner, we experience a resurrection. The death of a dream can become a gateway to a new direction in life. The death of your health can become an eye-opening experience in the preciousness of life. The death of a job can lead to a life-giving career. And even the death of your body can lead into the presence of God, the presence of love. And when we walk through these smaller deaths with faithfulness, with relinquishment, with trust, and we walk through them faithfully, we experience new life on the other side. These small moments of finding new life on the other side is resurrection. And all of life is a practice for the great surrender, the final surrender of our physical death. And the more willingly we participate with God in our own resurrection now, the easier this one moment of dying physically becomes when our time comes. And my prayer is that some of the last words that I will say on my deathbed, when I come to the gates of death, I will say the words, "I've been practicing for this one moment my whole life."
Hello and good morning. I have the honor today of reading the benediction done by John O'Donohue. The dead are not distant or absent. They are alongside us. When we lose someone to death, we lose their physical image and presence. We slip out of visible form into invisible presence. This alteration of form is the reason we cannot see the dead. But because we cannot see them does not mean that they are not there. Transfigured into eternal form, the dead cannot reverse the journey, and even for 1 second re-enter their old form to linger with us for a while. Though they cannot reappear, they continue to be near us. The part of the healing of grief is the refinement of our hearts, whereby we come to sense their loving nearness. When we ourselves enter the eternal world and come to see our lives on earth in full view, we may be surprised at the immense assistance and support with which our departed loved ones have accompanied every moment of our lives. In their new, transfigured presence, their compassion, understanding, and love take on a divine depth, enabling them to become secret angels, guiding and sheltering and unfolding of our destiny.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope this service has been a blessing to you. What now? 1, you could participate. If you would like to participate in our services, we would welcome your readings with a simple phone recording. Or 2, partner. If you would like to give financially to ensure the continuation of this online service, there is a link at the bottom of the screen. And 3, participate. Subscribe. You may subscribe on YouTube or like our page on Facebook to stay updated with our online services. We hope you have found some hope, help, and healing today. See you next week.